It's time for another podcast by George. Straight talk, straight from the heartland, that'll have you saying, by George, I think he's got it. Now, here's George.
Hello, hi, how are you? Welcome on in to another podcast by George. Got kind of a holiday edition here. For Labor Day. Labor Day means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And of course, the labor movement, first and foremost, the unions. I was in Teamsters. And when I was in reporting, I kind of wanted to be in a reporters union, but that just wasn't available as far as I knew anyway back in the day. But it also means something to reporters and people that remember history. And it has to do with the disappearance of Johnny Gosch. The Labor Day weekend always kind of coincides with that. Gosch disappeared on January 5th. We're going to get into that. We're going to talk about the missing boys in the Des Moines area. That's kind of the bad news, good news focus of this particular podcast. That's the bad news. We've got some good news that we're going to cover too. So wait for it, as they say. Hang on. And we're going to do it with our good friend here, our buddy, our pal that's coming on podcast by George. And it is Randy Evans. He's coming on the live line again. Randy Evans is the executive director of the Iowa Freedom of Information Council. It's a 40-year-old nonprofit education and advocacy organization that works for better open government and government accountability. Evans took over the role with the FOI Council in October 2015 after a 40-year career with the Des Moines Register. He joined the Register in 1974, first as a 1974, folks, as a news reporter, and then in various editing roles, including state editor, metro editor, news editor, and assistant managing editor. Now, he was editor of the Register's opinion pages during his final 4 years with the newspaper. Randy retired from the Register in December 2014 and began writing a weekly column on government and politics for the Bloomfield Democrat. And that kind of brought him full circle. I think that's just great. That column now appears regularly in, I don't know, half a dozen, maybe 8 newspapers and news websites. His writings also appear regularly in Iowa Capital Dispatch. That's one of those that we're going to be talking about today. It's going to fall into the news, the good news category. So wait for it. And I know that Randy would certainly agree with me that old reporters, we don't fade away. We just keep reporting. So let's say good morning to Randy Evans. Hello, Randy.
George, it's good to be with you.
Yeah, thanks for coming on in here, pal. I mentioned at the top here that I wanted to talk very briefly about Johnny Gosch, and got an interesting way of doing that. I'm going to bring this up on screen here. This is Kylie White Von Bali, and I would recommend people to go back into the podcastbygeorge.com video archive. Just scroll down. It's been over a year. I think it's been almost 2 years since I interviewed her. But Kylie wrote this outstanding book, The Monsters We Make. And there's what the book looks like. You can get it on Amazon, every place you can buy books. Pick that thing up because it's great. It's a great recounting historically, factually, of the situation with Johnny Gosch and 2 other missing boys from the Des Moines area. That it's a factual framework that is then fictionalized into this really terrifying work of fiction. And you got to read it. The Monsters We Make. You wonder what that's all about? You got to read the book to find out. But let me bring this up on screen, Randy. And I know this is something, that old reporters like us are well aware of. There's a picture of Johnny Gosch, and this is from IowaColdCases.org. I talk about cold cases a little bit on my podcast. I particularly talk about Jody Van Husentrude up in Mason City. I just have the tragedy of that. Disappeared from the face of the earth. Still no resolution of that particular case. I'll just read through this very quickly now because the podcast is also on audio. But Johnny Gosch is officially listed as a missing person. It's John David Gosch. He disappeared at age 12. He was born November 12th, 1969. Male, white, brown, eyes of blue. Here's something that I learned something all the time when I looked at this. Were you aware of this, Randy? He was at age 12. Johnny was 5'7" tall. He was a big boy. I was not aware of that. Yeah, and it's important in this case because you think about abductions and people being snatched or grabbed or something like that. Well, a guy that's 5'7" is not that easy to grab. We're not talking about a little kid here. Again, they don't know what happened to him, but he was 5'7", 140 pounds in West Des Moines, has a birthmark on his left cheek and a horseshoe-shaped scar on his tongue, which I guess I was unaware of that too. Again, last seen alive September 5th of 1982. So there's a good look at Johnny. Now, we're going to spend a hell of a lot of time on this because it's not a cold case podcast, but I wanted to go through this very briefly from coldcase.org. It's a story that shocked communities and catapulted Iowa into the national spotlight, changed state laws, and forever changed the way parents monitored their children's activities. 12-year-old Des Moines Register paperboy Johnny Gosch left his West Des Moines home Sunday morning, September 5th. Again, this is the kind of the anniversary date, 40 years that we're doing this podcast now. To begin his paper route, he wore a white sweatshirt with Kim's Academy on the back, warm-up pants, blue rubber flip-flops, and carried a yellow paper bag. Normally, his father, John Gosch, accompanied him on the route, but on the day, that day, Johnny went alone. I mean, my God, if that isn't Murphy's Law, that type of thing, he never came home. Okay, so I was in the newsroom. So was Randy. We had this situation with Johnny Gosch, and then boom, a couple of years later, almost, right at 2 years later, Eugene Wade Martin. He was 13, disappeared on August 17th. No, that's his date of birth, August 17th. I'm sorry. Hair color, brown, eye color, brown, 110 pounds, 5 foot tall, more of what you would think of for a boy that age. He disappeared on August 12th of 1984. So right around his birthday. And so here's what it says about Eugene Martin. On Sunday morning, August 12th, 1984, 13-year-old Eugene Martin left his home at approximately 5 a.m. to deliver the Des Moines Register newspaper in the Des Moines area. He wore blue jeans, a red shirt, and a gray pullover. So early morning hours, just like Johnny Gosch, to deliver the papers. Eugene normally delivered with his oldest stepbrother, but on this day went alone. God, again, Murphy's Law, this karma thing. Iowa State Fair was in town, and Eugene, who in his free time enjoyed football, fishing, skating, video games, and TV, wanted to make some extra money. Witnesses said they saw Martin talking to a clean-cut white male in his 30s, sometime between 5 and 5:45 a.m. at Southwest 12th Street. I've been in that area a lot, and Highway Drive. Some stated the two appeared to be engaged in a friendly father-son sort of conversation, and others recalled seeing the teen folding papers and talking to the man sometime between 5:45 and 6:05 a.m. Now, between 6:10 and 6:15 a.m., Eugene's bag was found on the ground outside of Des Moines with 10 folded papers still inside. So this is the south side, right by the city limits back then anyway. So found on the ground outside of Des Moines. When customers called to report not receiving their morning newspapers, the manager went out, found the bag, and delivered the papers. At approximately 8:40 a.m., the search for Eugene began. He has not been seen since. All right, I'm going to take that off screen right here for the moment. I want to bring Randy back in here full screen. Randy, my recollections of this, I got a couple of things I want to talk about. Number one, I was the live breaking news reporter at WHO. I mean, when stuff was going down, I was the guy that they sent out there. But the interesting thing about these disappearances, there wasn't a lot of live breaking news with it. By the time we found out about it, it was all over with. There wasn't any scene to go to. There wasn't any live reporting that I did on it. But with Eugene Martin, I did happen to have a little bit of a footnote scoop on that. I was the first reporter to interview his parents. I interviewed his mother live on WHO the very next morning. And I've told this on the podcast before, but I asked her specifically, I said, did you ever give any thought to not allowing your son to deliver the newspapers because of the situation with Johnny Gosch? And here's the thing that really torques me to this very day, but we were coming under the direction of a consultant, a national consulting firm. That guy was listening to me do this interview, which, I mean, it was a scoop. It was a live report with the mother the very next morning, Randy. And I no sooner got off the air and the phone rang. This guy called me from out of town. and gave me hell for being so insensitive as to ask that question to her as to whether or not she'd given any thought to not having him deliver the papers. But of course, it was in context. It was in historical context. It was because I knew the situation with Johnny Gosch. So did everybody else on WHO, as an example. But this guy wasn't from here, the consultant. He didn't know what the hell I was talking about. He thought I was just being a jerk and trying to put the blame on the mother for allowing the son to go out and deliver the newspapers. But that isn't what I was getting at all. What I was getting at was this practice of allowing kids to deliver these newspapers, and it was still ongoing at that time. And I kind of want you to pick up the story a little bit there and talk a little bit about that angle or your memories of those two missing newspaper boys.
Well, I think you have identified with the question that you asked the mother. You identified right off the bat one of the first questions that came to people's minds when Eugene Martin disappeared was why parents were still letting their young kids go out, depending on the time of the year, while it was still dark out, to deliver newspapers. And that was working at the register during that span of time. That was on the minds of the corporate officials, from the beginning with Johnny Gosch's disappearance. Was, it was a tragedy all the way around, but the business side of the register, had relied on young kids to deliver their product 7 days a week, 52 weeks out of the year. And it, the register hired a security director. The register was working to encourage safe practices on, carriers. But, it still came down to a business model that relied on, young kids to deliver the product. And, those two disappearances have changed the way newspapers across the country are delivered these days. You now have adults who are in cars, rather than kids who are riding bicycles or walking with the news bag slung over their shoulders, or pulling the coaster wagon with the Sunday editions stacked in it. So it's, the newspaper executives knew from the beginning what a devastating turn of events this was going to be, beyond just the horribleness of the disappearances.
Well, and it's a good thing too. The kids love it. I mean, yeah, you can talk to anybody that grew up, delivering the newspapers, the extra money and that type of thing. It was a great way to kind of instill a work ethic in young people. And, it was a win-win on both sides of it. But after that Eugene Martin thing, I actually wanted to do a story. Now this is a little bit of inside baseball here, but I wanted to contact the register and ask them exactly what you're talking about, this business practice, whether or not they were going to end it, whether or not they were at the very least going to suspend it. But in my newsroom at WHO, Bob Wilbanks, my mentor, my God, you won't hear me ever say anything bad about Bob. I mean, I love the man. Rest in peace. He didn't actively discourage me, as I recall. He didn't tell me not to do it, but I was not encouraged to do that angle, to report on it that way. Now, I don't know that the register did very much. At the time, really all you had was, the registers statewide and your local, radio and television stations to report on this thing. So that particular angle, to my knowledge, never really got covered. Did the register ever postpone, suspend, or end that practice after Eugene Martin, or did those kids keep delivering the newspapers?
My recollection is that, the kids continued to deliver. The security director that they hired who came out of a law enforcement background. His role was to, work with parents and kids so that they knew how to better look after themselves when they were delivering papers. I could never get up early enough to deliver a morning newspaper. My two brothers did, and there were times when I would, go out and fill in for them. And there's a peacefulness early in the morning before people are headed off to work and all of that, and that peacefulness, I think, sort of gave rise to a comfort level that was not necessarily warranted as conditions changed in our country. But at the time these two boys disappeared, it was not unusual for there to be missing kid reports that would come in, and and it in many instances they were like young people disappearing these days, where they're gone for a day or two, and they get in an argument with mom or dad, and they disappear. But so there was a initially kind of a giving sort of the benefit of the doubt to that was what was apparently would happen to Johnny, that people were asking questions about whether there was any kind of discord in the home or anything that would lead him to disappear. But as time went by, it became much more obvious. And your point about the media that was paying attention to it, part of the changing times that we live in now, you have television have these crime reconstruction shows, the Dateline 48 hours kinds of programs that that bring public attention to these kinds of cases, and as people around the region learn more about them, you have more eyeballs that are tuned in to see what's going on, and what kinds of witnesses may have what they may have seen. But at that time, it was like other crimes that occurred. It was a local story in the beginning.
In the beginning, it was. And of course, now it's nationwide, it's worldwide. I'm going to get to a little bit more of this, but I'm really struck by what you were talking about, the changing times. And this has to do with what Callie was writing about in her books, too, in this book, The Monsters We Make. It's how the world changed a little bit from back then, Randy, and I'm sure that you would agree with this. It was not uncommon back then to hear about 16-year-olds going off and joining the military.
Yeah.
14-year-olds had stuck their thumb out and gone to Haight-Ashbury just 10 years earlier than that. I mean, that's kind of the era that we were living in. It was, kids would pick up and run off and come back home. Some would, some didn't. I mean, the world has changed. It's not like that any longer. And I want to bring this on screen because I talked about Callie's book here, The Monsters We Make. And this book brought to light something that I was not aware of. And it's this. It's Mark James Warren Allen, because her book isn't about two missing boys in Des Moines. It's about three. Mark James Warren Allen, at the time of the report, 13 years old. He was born in 1972. He was 5 foot tall. He was 85 pounds. He was missing March 29th of 1986. So about
2 years.
Johnny Gosch to Eugene Martin was about 2 years. And then this kid on the south side of Des Moines was about 2 years later. On March 29th, 1986, the day before Easter, 13-year-old Mark James Warren Allen told his mother that he planned to walk to a friend's house down the street, but never arrived at the neighbor's home, and he hasn't been seen since. Based on previous media reports, Allen initially was thought to be the third Iowa paper boy. They thought he was the third Iowa paper boy to vanish without a trace during the 80s. Johnny Gosch, as we mentioned, 12 of West Des Moines, disappeared on September 5th of 1982. 13-year-old Eugene Martin vanished from Des Moines' South Side just 2 years later on August 12th, 1984, under very similar circumstances. An in-depth Des Moines Register article on Iowa's missing persons published August 18, 2013, confirmed Allen. He was not a paper boy in Des Moines. So this kid was not a paper boy. It wasn't in the early morning hours delivering the newspaper, but other than that, it's strikingly familiar. It says 3 decades later, however, all three boys' cases remain unsolved. And this kind of gets a little bit to what we were just talking about here, which is kind of interesting. Mark's mother, Nancy Allen, admitted her son had been a handful. The teen had been shifted back and forth between her Iowa residence and his father's Minnesota home most of his young life, and he'd often get into trouble. And so, again, I don't know. This was hardly reported at all, and it certainly wasn't reported in the context of Gosch and Martin, and that might have had a little bit to do with it, Randy.
Well, I think that one of the flaws in the way the public, as well as journalists and law enforcement, viewed missing persons reports back then was that everybody sort of gave deference to, oh, they'll come back home, because I think one of the problems that Noreen Gosch talked about with Johnny's case was the failure of law enforcement to take the report that he had potentially been abducted, to take it seriously. You described Johnny's build, his height and his weight, as suggesting that here was a young person who would be big enough to take care of themselves. But I think that the problem was that there was not that sort of flood the zone mentality in law enforcement that you now see when there is a missing person report, particularly a young person who disappears. You will see on the news, TV, press releases from law enforcement these days where some teenager or preteen doesn't return home after going to a friend's house or whatever. Yeah. You will see law enforcement devoting many more resources in those first hours after they get the report, rather than we're going to sit back and wait for a few days to see if he comes home. And I think the same thing happens with journalists, or happened with journalists back then. When you read about the mother saying, well, he was a handful, too many people, too many journalists assumed from the start that he had just taken off.
Yeah.
And I think if we've learned anything in the 40 years is that things that we think are too bizarre to happen may well have happened, and that we need to, it's easier to devote a lot of resources from law enforcement and then find out 2 or 3 days into it that the person was at a friend's home all of that time. It's a whole lot easier to go to bed and sleep at night knowing that's what occurred, rather than law enforcement or journalists waiting for several days and before they take it seriously, and then we find no sign at all for 40 years of the person.
I got to say this too. I'm a cynic of law enforcement. Maybe it's because I used to cover it, but I've always told people that now with the DNA and the kind of forensics that they're having, they're solving cases that they never have before. But before that was available back in the day, I used to tell people that most cases, most investigations are solved when an ex-girlfriend or an ex-wife calls the police station and gives somebody up. I mean, that
Mhm.
was always my sense of how a lot of these cases were resolved. They were resolved on tips and people giving other people up. That's the way that it happened a lot of times. Of course, it did not happen in these cases. And before we move off this, Randy, I think you probably would agree with this too. I'm going to give Noreen Gosch a little bit of slack because, you know, she's been criticized so roundly by so many people. And my God, if your kid was abducted, what would happen to you? How would you respond and how would you act? And people say, well, she made up these things and she told police that he'd visited her in the night and that type of thing. And I always looked at that and I thought, now to your point, what she was talking about, she didn't think that this was getting the attention, the ongoing attention, because the kid was still missing. They didn't
Mhm.
have any leads really. They didn't appear that they were doing very much. Okay, I'll give them a lead. Maybe it's a fake lead, but it'll bring the visibility of it back up in the police department and in the public's eye and keep this thing going because that's how, in her mind, and I think she's probably right, it was going to get resolved. That, you know, people have to be thinking about it. It's got to be front of
Yeah.
mind with law
Well,
enforcement and the public. Yeah.
and I think it is far too easy for people to criticize her, uh, but I think people don't appreciate the tremendous uh, stress and pressure that she and her husband lived under, uh, for all of those years. I mean, it was the waiting and wondering and worrying about what had happened to Johnny. It was, uh, you know, journalists calling up, asking questions on an anniversary, or when some uh, young person disappeared someplace else around the country. It was a constant pressure cooker. I'm confident, and uh, unless we've walked in Noreen's shoes, I think we ought to, as you say, cut her some slack, uh, because uh, she uh, she bore uh, the job of keeping her son's case in front of the public because uh, fewer tips are going to come in when people have put it out of mind.
That's exactly right. Well, before we change gears here, because this is kind of a bad news, good news podcast. And I
Yeah.
actually thought about, do I want to make it good news? Start with the good news and then move into the bad news. Now
No,
let's
you
get
want to
the,
end on
yeah,
you want to end on good news.
let's get the bad news out of the way. Anything else on this particular cold case? Any final thoughts? Anything you want to say, or have we covered it? Do you
Well,
think?
no, yeah, I mean it's been 40 years, and I've followed every uh, twist and turn and development, and as I get older, one of the regrets I have is that I worry that I'm not going to know the final chapter of the story, uh, and it's not only Johnny and Eugene Martin, but it's also the Jody Huisentruit disappearance as well.
Yes, yes.
Uh, you know, you just wonder what occurred and when some tip is going to come in that somebody thinks is probably of no value to anything, but that is the piece that sort of helps the law enforcement put all of the other pieces together. And I think DNA technology is going to uh, help bring a resolution of one sort. When remains are found, uh, you know, I think that will answer the whatever happened question, but it may well not answer the question of who and how. But you've paid attention to the news enough. You've seen these uh, serial killers who have traveled, you know, great distances and people who disappeared and were everybody had sort of put them out of mind, and then something happens that starts bringing it all together, and we start learning a little more about it. And I'm ready to learn more about it. I would like to find the answers to what happened to these folks questions.
Hi, God. So would I. And a couple of final comments here. When it comes to Eugene Martin and Johnny Gosch and this kid on the South Side, particularly the South Side abductions, and it shows what you're talking about. Time goes on, these little pieces of information float around. I was talking to a guy, he's a musician, a local musician here just a few years ago. He was in the parking lot on his bicycle back at this time in the 80s. The parking lot of Target South. I think it was Target South, then it's now Hy-Vee or whatever. And a guy came up to him in a car and said some strange things. And we were talking about the disappearance of Johnny Gosch and Eugene Martin and all that. I said, man, you gotta tell the cops about that. Well, God, it was 40 years ago. His memory isn't very good, but of the precise circumstances. But he had talked to somebody in the parking lot there, which is very close to the disappearance of Eugene Martin and that third paper boy in particular. My God, it's just down the street from where he disappeared. And I don't know that he ever told me. I encouraged him to go to police with it and tell somebody. And with Jody Huisentruit, I've had them on my show a lot, the findjody.com people, Randy. Here's what I suggested. And I'm sure law enforcement has looked at every angle of this, but I said, go to a seed corn company, go to a propane delivery company. Go find your oldest sales representative that was calling on farmers in the area around where Jody disappeared. The same would be true with these missing paper boys and that type of thing. Have them tell you who they remember as being the craziest, oddest, strangest, reclusive weirdo that they delivered seed corn or propane to. See if they remember, if something like that jumps out at them, because to me, that could be the answer to this. Everybody thinks about the city, the metro, somebody involved, but it could have been somebody on the outskirts too, because
somebody passing through.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's it. True. Somebody that was not from this area at all. And I know that, and with Huisentruit in particular, that's part of their case study. Okay. I want to move off of this. My God, I don't want to, because it is kind of gloomy. And I'm with Randy. I hope we can find resolution to this, but let's bring this up on screen now. This is actually why I wanted to have him on, because we have all this gloom and doom on. Randy, I talk about climate war and healthcare. And I mean, I am getting extremely negative, particularly when it comes to the climate. My God, it looks to me like it's game over, or it's going to be a variation of it here. And there's very little that we can do. If we can do something, we need to get on it. And you wrote this article about a welcome antidote for what ails our spirits. I think of Randy Evans, folks. I think of this old, gnarly newspaper editor guy. I think he's got newsprint, in his, or newsprint ink in his veins or whatever. No, he's a guy that can look at things in a soft-hearted way and look at things positively. This reads, and this was in the Iowa Capital Dispatch where your stuff appears. Not all of the best medicine comes with a prescription from a physician. Don't read this to mean I am advocating treating coronavirus with ivermectin, a drug more often used on horses. That's not what's on my mind today, Randy says. Recent news has left many of us discouraged. Floods, windstorms, my God, shootings, politicians, pestilence, and on and on and on. It's not surprising the news has jolted many people's psyche. Randy says, I found other news that gives me a boost of positive energy that is worth sharing and saving. Okay, so I'm thinking, you have? Where's that at? What's that all about? Well, and it starts off here kind of like we were talking about. It starts with the bad news kind of. Athletic competition these days is filled with too many examples of unsportsmanlike conduct. And you write that I remember the awful scene captured on a spectator's cell phone video live last winter when players were walking through the customary handshake line after a high school basketball game in central Iowa. Now, I've got this. I'm going to play this. and yeah, against wait for it, as they say, because this is bad, folks. Honestly, we're doing the bad news. We're going to get to the good news here. So watch this. We'll come right back.
Ready? Go Cats.
The Carlisle-Nevada basketball game just ended and the players were in the post-game handshake line. That's when the fight began. Take a close look. Instead of shaking hands, it appears Carlisle player number 4 throws a couple surprise punches and Nevada player number 5. The first punch to the stomach, the second punch to the jaw. The Nevada player appears to be knocked out as he falls to the floor. Several more students join in the fight. It was a shock for those fans watching the game and those seeing it blow up later on social media.
Okay, Randy. So I got a couple of things, and I'm just thinking as I watch that again, it kind of surprised me that that was reported that way as a fight. I don't see any fight there. I see a sucker punch. I see one kid. I don't know what his issue is, but he's just lunging at this other kid, hitting him in the head. People have to realize, and Hollywood is conditioned us to think otherwise. I've always reminded people that if you hit someone in the head, if you hit them in the head particularly hard enough to knock them out, there's a good, not a good chance, but there is a real chance you're going to kill them.
Well,
I mean, it happens that way.
Somebody falling and hitting their head.
Yeah, on the
In
floor.
this instance, there was another player to sort of cushion his fall, but you know what you saw in this high school game was not what you're accustomed to seeing in high school, but you see it far too often in the professional level, where people who make millions of dollars a year have no way to settle their disagreements other than with their fists, and you know that's unfortunate, and that's what made the incident that I wrote about, in my mind, a whole lot more heartwarming and refreshing and needed, quite frankly, with the climate that we live in these days.
And we're going to get to that. This is the good news that I told everybody to wait on. I will say this, Randy, and you just mentioned that this has always been with us. This has been around. It's on the professional scene as you're talking about, even on the local scene. My dad's lifetime. I mean, we're going back, oh my God, 60 years, 70 years ago or whatever. There was an instance where in one of these local high schools around here, a guy slugged a referee. I mean, again, I think he was a little meshuggah. I mean, he just decked a referee. And again, I want to say this is not a fight. What you just saw there, that's a sucker punch. And to put it in the context of a fight kind of gives it some, I don't know, legitimacy that it doesn't deserve. This was not a mano a mano, straight up kind of a fight between two kids or anything even close to this. This was just sucker punching somebody, hitting them in the head like that. And okay, so let me bring this up on screen now. I want to get to this to continue with what you're talking about. And we were talking about this event occurring at a regional baseball championship game between teams of 12-year-olds from suburban Houston, Texas, and Tulsa, Oklahoma. There was a lot on the line, a trip to the Little League World Series for the winner, and for the loser, the end of the baseball season, and thoughts forever of what might have been. That happened to me in baseball. That's for another story. Let me play this video. Let's watch this, and then we'll get Randy's thoughts on this one. Okay, folks, we're getting to the good news here. Here we go.
Oh, look out.
So this is really cool because as a pitcher, Bubs looks shaken up right now because of what he did. And look at Zay Jarvis. This is such great sportsmanship. He wants him to know that it's okay, that he'll be fine.
Hey, Bob. Look at me. Look at me. You're all right.
Amazing.
You're all right. Look at me. Hey, look. You can do it.
Okay, so yeah, several things come to me out of that. I want to get Randy to put this in context a little bit better. But for me personally, I was in a ball game in Indianola They had a fireball pitcher up there, a real good pitcher. This guy had a curveball that was really good. He had everybody, jumping out of the box, stepping in the bucket, as they used to say, to avoid thinking that this guy was going to get him with a fastball. I had a buddy of mine. This guy, I've had him on my podcast before. He's something else. He really is. He has no fear. Really, he has no fear. It was proven on that day because he was going to stand in there no matter what. He wasn't going to step in the bucket. He wasn't going to back out on that guy's curveball. So that guy, that pitcher reared back and threw that pitch. It wasn't a curve. It was a fastball. It hit him in the head just like that. Had the same result, maybe even worse, because I think he went to the ER over that particular situation. Now, this kid was able to pick himself up off the ground. What you saw there is really heartwarming. I really like what the coach did, Randy, because you got to look in these kids' eyes. I mean, when they get hit like this, that's how you determine a concussion. I mean, look in their eyes and see what you see. And if it doesn't look right, there's something that isn't right. So I really like what the coach did there. But anyway, that's my part of it. Go ahead and put this in context for us. What we saw.
When I saw the video and the batter reached first base, and then he paused just ever so briefly, and then turned and walked towards the mound. And I'm conditioned, having seen this occur in college games, professional baseball games, where the batter who is hit is going to take out his anger on the pitcher. And what made it so refreshing was that the batter was more concerned about the pitcher than he was concerned about himself. And there's all sorts of lessons to be taken from that. I like the quote. It's in the column, and it was the batter's father who was involved in the Little League program. That. And the father said that, we're more concerned about raising good boys than making great baseball players. And I thought, you talk about somebody who has things in the proper perspective, and it's obvious that the father's attitude was one that was being followed by the team, the Little League teams, coaches and players. We need more lessons like that imparted, because that it certainly stands out with the way things are in our nation today, where you've wronged me, and so I'm going to get a pound of flesh out of you.
Mm-hmm. And it reminds me again. So I had that turned around a little bit in that video because it was edited. It's actually the player giving the hugs, the player that got hit. Is that correct?
Right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
And the pitcher's feeling badly about it. Yeah.
The pitcher is all distraught, which because he's worrying about the batter that he hit squarely in the forehead. The difference between this batter and your friend was that helmets are probably better these days than they were back there in the 19th century or the 18th century when you played. But it's the pitcher was also just distraught because he's supposed to be the one who's in charge, and he had sort of lost control of both of the pitch and the game. But the other player, the opposing player, instead of taunting or whatever, he was more focused on helping this pitcher who he didn't know sort of get back in the game.
That last line there is the one that you referenced. Isaiah's father, Austin Jarvis, put it this way: being a good person is more important than being a great player. And these are elite level Little League players. That's one part of it. The other thing is it's always good to put things in context for these kids, and parents don't do that very often. I'm reminded of the Amateur Hockey League here in Des Moines. We used to have a guy that ran that, and when he got the parents together, to talk about the the introduction to amateur, the initiation. He would tell them first thing, and here's the first thing: none of your kids are ever going to play in the NHL. It ain't going to happen. If they're in this program at this age, none of them are going to be in the National Hockey League. So what's most important is exactly what he's talking about here. These kids need to be great people, good people, and that's more important than being a great player. Okay, so let's move along here. So I like this one too for several different reasons. But you write, a needed lift. Traveling by horse and buggy may not be your cup of tea. Forgoing electricity might not ring your bell, but the Amish people of Davis County taught us all a wonderful lesson this month when it came time to move a large barn on a farm west of Bloomfield. Now, this is Randy's turf. He knows this area. So let me play this, and then we'll come right back. Yeah, okay. So I like that on a lot of different levels, Randy, but tell us what we just saw there.
Well, the Davis County has I think it's the second largest Amish population of any county in the state. I mean, there are several thousand Amish residents in Davis County. So when it came time to have this barn moved, because the family had built a new home, the barn is used to house their buggies and their horses. The contractor who could have moved the barn by more conventional means was booked up for a while, so the Amish took it upon themselves. The word went out to the dozen Amish churches in Davis County that they were going to move it the old-fashioned way. They were going to pick it up and walk it. They walked it. I think it was the length of two or three football fields. The thing weighed, I think, in about 4 to 5 tons, and there were 300. You saw, several dozen there. There was about 300 Amish men and young boys who shouldered that barn up off its foundation and walked it to the new location and set it down. I'm not sure that you could have had a more steady move. When you looked at the shirts on these farmers at the end of the process, that they had been working because the shirts were sweated through. But it was, the math on the number of pounds. They had calculated out how much each person could lift and carry. And so it was, 70 to 100 pounds or something like that. Mm-hmm. But it was, there was one Bloomfield resident who was one of the few, as they say in the Amish community, one of the few English, which is the term for non-Amish. Yeah. He was helping with it, but he took away important lessons that, the Amish exist without, horses and buggy, or without cars and trucks, without diesel-powered tractors. They rely on horses and themselves. And the English gentleman said that, all sorts of communities could benefit from that by everybody pitching in and carrying their share of the load, instead of worrying about what's in it for me. And what was in it for the 300 farmers, the Amish farmers, was fresh hot ham sandwich and a dish of homemade ice cream, which, in the grand scheme of things was a pretty good compensation there.
Yeah, and I love the Amish. Obviously, everybody has issues. Their community has issues. You see that a lot in the news, and that there's a lot of criticism. But I want to tell you something. The big three on Podcast by George: climate, war, and healthcare. Those might not be the big three if we'd listen. I always tell people if we'd listen to the hippies back in the 60s, or if we'd listened to the Amish and led our lives a little bit more like they do, we wouldn't have climate, war, and healthcare destroying humanity the way that it is. Okay, I'm going to play this again because I really like that clip. And I want people to look at a couple of things here. Now, keep in mind what Randy was talking about. Everybody has to pull their own weight. I love the cooperation, the collaborative nature of this. And also the guy in the foreground, I think maybe he's taking a video or so. The guy in the short pants, that's not Amish. They don't wear shorts. So I don't know who that guy is, but he's not one of them. But look on the left side of the line here, and you'll see a guy, a short guy. And I jumped right out at me because I've always been vertically challenged, folks. And everybody's got to do their part of this. And he wants to, like Randy was talking about. But the way that the taller guys can lift it like this, that doesn't work for him. And he knows it. And he needs to he wants to do his 170 pounds. So you'll see him move to try to do that. So watch this very closely. And here we go again. Yeah, an overarching issue. The best thing about this may be the cooperation, the collaboration, doing something with others, not isolated in your home, watching a big screen or online or something like that. Those people are out there sweating, doing something for the common good. That's cool.
One of the spectators that day is an Amish gentleman I know who he's in his 60s now, but when he was a teenager, he was paralyzed when he dived into a pond. He spent weeks at university hospitals in Iowa City. The Amish, they don't believe in insurance, and the administrators at university hospitals were kept fidgeting around this family, wondering to know how they were going to take care of the bill. And my Amish friend's father said, "Don't worry about it; it'll be taken care of." And when it came time to for the teenager to go back home to Davis County and to continue his recuperation, the bill was taken care of by the Amish all pitching in to do their part to help this family through what could have been the death of one of their friends and neighbors, but he turned out to be he lived through it. He's operated a business that employs several dozen people, but it all, he came through it because the Amish all pitched in. It wasn't, I'm just looking out for my own family, my own self. And to my way of thinking, that kind of an attitude is one that we can all learn from. Whether you want to spend your life riding behind a horse in a buggy, or whether you want to live in a house that has no electricity or not, you don't have to buy it all to accept a philosophy that is worth emulating. If you remember the English man in I think it was Ohio, who walked into an Amish school and opened fire with a gun and murdered about a dozen Amish kids and a teacher. The response of the Amish wasn't to exact a pound of flesh. The reaction of the Amish was to bake casseroles and pies and take it to the parents of the gunmen, who the Amish knew were suffering just as much as the families that had lost their kids at this school. There are also all sorts of lessons that we can take from what occurred in the nickel mines community of Ohio.
My God, that's a great ending, Randy. I don't know if we can do any better than that. We're coming up to the top of the hour here. The show's about over with, but that's a great closer. Do you have anything else that you want to say, or should we leave it there?
Oh, I appreciate the opportunity, George. I think that newspapers and TV, we get criticized sometimes for not giving attention to good news, and I don't think that means that we have to ignore the negative news, but I think that we owe it to our readers and our viewers to give them a taste of the good news, the news that we can learn from in other ways.
Well, that's well said, and to be expected, folks. He's a wordsmith. He's a truth teller. That's Randy Evans. He's the executive director of the Iowa Freedom of Information Council. He was with the Des Moines Register for 40 years. He's been reporting. He started when he was 16 years old, something like that. We're talking, my God, Randy, half a century. Yeah. That is amazing. We'll circle back. We'll get back with him again. I have people talk about Randy. They want to know when he's coming back on the show, so we will get back to him. Thanks again, pal. We'll visit again soon.
Thanks, George.
And folks, I'll leave it like this, like I always do. That's another edition. That's another live line on podcastbygeorge.com. If you like these videos, all you got to do is like us on Facebook, and the notifications will come up there. Give us a thumbs up on Facebook. On YouTube, subscribe, ring the notification bell, make a comment, whatever you want to do there. Again, they'll notify you when the video's released. Now, when the audio is released on iTunes and Spotify, Libsyn, iHeartRadio app, Deezer, Stitcher, all of those strange sounding places. Go to podcastbygeorge.com and pick an icon, pick a little badge there, click on it. It'll take you to those sites, and you can very easily subscribe just to Podcast by George on those sites when the audio version is released. But that is going to do it. That's going to wrap it up. That's all there is. And there ain't no more. That's another podcast